Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Lutheran and Child and Family Services of Illinois virtual annual meeting. My name is Mike Bertrand, and I'm the president and CEO of LCFS. I have the honor of serving as the moderator for today's webinar. Let me start by thanking all of you for joining us. We're pleased to have individuals and organizations participating from around the country, not just many colleagues from Illinois that we're glad to see, but as you can see from this map, we've got participants checking in from all over the country. One of the advantages, I guess, of virtual versus doing this meeting in person as we've historically done, because this is an incredibly important topic of dismantling institutional racism and achieving racial equity in child welfare, not just in child welfare, but throughout our communities. It's not just a local challenge, it's not a state challenge, it's a national and even global issue. So what I'd like to share you very briefly what brought LCFS to this place. So we tasked our Inclusion Council about 10-15 years ago. We developed an Inclusion Council within our organization of representatives from our staff from around the state of Illinois. We tasked them almost 4 years ago to help us get to the next level. And we came up what we call as our WIDE initiative, which stands for, as you can see from the slide, welcoming, inclusive, diverse, and equitable. And part of that initiative was to work and strive to make LCFS an anti-racism organization. And we knew that we could not do that without also looking within our own world, knowing that systemic racism plays out in our country, in our state, in our communities, and we can assume that the effects are also playing out within our organization. So for this afternoon's webinar, we'll be utilizing both the chat and Q&A functions that Zoom offers. You can use the chat to connect with other attendees throughout the event and also respond to what you're hearing during the presentations. If you have questions for the panelists, we encourage you to submit those using the Q&A function at any time. At the end of the event, we'll have time for a Q&A session where we'll try to answer as many as we possibly can. Today's discussion will include a presentation by LCFS Vice President and Chief Operating Officer Beverly Jones on our work around improving outcomes for youth and families of color within our foster care program. We'll also have a panel discussion with Beverly participating, as well as Rich Bobby, Chief Program Officer for Children's Services at Little City, and Zack Schrantz, a Senior Strategic Advisor for UCAN. Now to get us started, it's my privilege to introduce Beverly Jones to highlight LCFS work in creating equitable outcomes for children and families of color within the child welfare system. Beverly has an incredibly impressive bio. She currently serves as LCFS Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. Her career in social services spans more than 40 years and includes experiences at local, state, and national levels. Prior to joining LCFS, she was the Deputy Division Director of Programs and Policy for the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, Director of the Fulton County Department of Family and Children's Services in Atlanta, and the Assistant Commissioner for the Division of Learning and Professional Development with the New Jersey Department of Children and Families. Other highlights include Intake and Family Service Administrator for the Child and Family Service Agency in Washington, D.C., Director of the Arkansas Division of Children and Family Services, and active involvement with the child welfare reform effort in Arkansas when Governor Clinton appointed her to a panel of national experts who reviewed the current service system and recommended changes. Today, Beverly is also a member of the Human Rights Campaign All Children, All Families National Advisory Council, Lutheran Services in America's Children and Youth Practice Group, and is co-chair of DCFS Child Welfare Advisory Committee. She also represents our agency in the Lutheran Services in America Results Innovation Lab, focusing on decreasing disparate outcomes for children of color. We're honored to have Beverly as a champion of the children and families we serve at LCFS. I'm also honored to have the opportunity to have Beverly, who always asks, what else, what are we not seeing? What else should we be thinking on behalf of families? So I get the honor of learning from Beverly every day. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Beverly.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. And my goal for today is to share with you our agency's journey as we committed to addressing the issue of systemic racism. This is not research. It is our story and our approach and the results we've been able to achieve thus far. I also need to say that while I'm the presenter, this is a total team and agency effort. So special thanks to all of our staff who help us every day in serving children and families better. So I share with you our, what we call population results statement. And you can see our contribution to the greater good is that all 2,897,185,000 youth in Illinois will have loving forever families. That is our greater good. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, that all of this work is how much and how well are we contributing to that population result. Mike already mentioned to you the Inclusion Council and the mission of the Inclusion Council. And without that group, and we need them. They, I am and as most of my family are rabid sports fans. So I think of our Inclusion Council as our general manager and our coaching team, keeping us on point and purposeful. And before you are the 4 areas that, as we thought about this work and how we wanted to begin, that these 4 areas became very evident to us. One is around how welcoming and affirming are we to our staff and newly hired people? What are the current barriers to our organizational environment? To being affirming and welcoming, recognition that things have occurred that are counterproductive to welcoming and affirming, and that silence only contributes to the culture of silence, so that we needed to speak up and speak up loudly and boldly. So as we began to think about systemic racism and what we wanted to do, the conversations among each other were who was racist and who was not, and led to a lot of frustration, resentment, bitterness, accusations, back and forth. And so we paused for a moment and said, how can we move this away from you're racist, no, I'm not, to really looking at the issue of systemic racism? And we started with reading a book, and it's called The Colorblind. And it was mandatory reading for all LCFS personnel in leadership. And it really helped bring us together and form and think about systemic racism and its impact on all of us, regardless of race identity. And as a result of that, we decided, first of all, we needed to create an organizational commitment statement about becoming an anti-racist organization, what that meant, and it is attached for you to see what is now our commitment to becoming an anti-racist organization. It is posted in all of our offices. So anybody who comes into one of our offices from the public will see this commitment, and it's a way of holding one another accountable to what we hope to achieve. Mike already mentioned WIDE, that we include in every new employee orientation session, in everyone's annual personnel evaluation. There is a requirement that every employee makes a commitment to the organization around addressing systemic racism. It's now part of our 5-year strategic plan, as well as when we interview new employees who may be considering coming to work for LCFS, that we talk about color cognizance regardless of the position for which you are applying, but asking essentially the same questions for everybody. We've had a number of staff who participated in the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services anti-racism transformation teams. We participated in a quality review process around race, systemic racism and the issues that have arisen, and listening to parents talk to us about this issue. We now require that all leadership staff, meaning anyone who's a supervisor and above, attend Crossroads training. And Crossroads is a national organization. It really is Crossroads Dismantling Systemic Racism, which we have found very important in creating a common framework, language, and concepts. What's listed below is a lot of this was we discussed last year at our annual meeting, and here's a link for anybody who wants to can go back and learn a lot more by looking at the presentation from last year. Doing all of that groundwork, there are two major questions. What does our data tell us regarding disparate outcomes and racial equity practice? And two, if disparity exists, what are we going to do? So our data, and so going back to our population result, that we said we wanted every child in Illinois to have a loving forever family. Well, our contribution to that result are children in care. And we made a commitment that we wanted to address children of color who, how long do they stay in care, and how long does it take for them to achieve permanency? And so you can see from the graph, September 2018, 4% of African-American youth in our care had achieved permanency. That really is unacceptable and embarrassing to us all. And we made a commitment that we were going to increase that by 5% in a year's time. So it would mean moving from 5% to 9%. So if you look over the course of time, we have steadily increased the percentage of African-American youth achieving permanency. And by achieving permanency, we mean reunification, adoption, or legal guardianship. So by March of 2019, we were at 10% or 6% increase. By June, we were at 14% or a 10% increase. And all the way up to where we, as of October of last year, we had achieved 47%. Our goal for going forward is 50%. And we track this regularly by at least quarter, if not sooner. So we are proud, not satisfied, but proud of the results we've achieved. The second part of our goal was to decrease the time it took to achieve permanency. So you can see in fiscal year 2019, it took 866 days to achieve permanency. As of October 2020, it's now decreased to 728%, or at least, which results in a 16% decrease. Still too long, but progress being made. We also looked at Latinx youth and around those same two factors, who was achieving permanency and how long did it take. And once you can see in 2018, we had none of the Latinx children we served achieving permanency. And we have gone all the way up to 20%. Once again, progress being made, and we're proud of that, but still have a long ways to go. We also looked at how long it took. So in 2019, it took 1,545 days for permanency achievement to occur. That is totally unacceptable. And you can see as of October, it was decreased to 235 days. But if you look closely, you can see that only represents one child who's Latinx where that occurred. But it does show with focus and attention and the right work, you can make a difference around length of stay. As a result of this, we went back and said, okay, if we're committed that every child has a loving forever family, we need to look at, for those children who return home, do they stay home? Otherwise, if they have to come back into care, we're not meeting our commitment that every child will have a loving forever family. So you can see from September 2018 to October 20, it really should be October 2020, not 21, now that I see that. 61% of all our permanencies were reunification. 33% were adoption and 6% legal guardianship. So we thought, well, that's good. We felt we're really proud that 61% of the children who achieved permanency were able to be reunified with their birth families. The question is, do they stay home? So those are the actual numbers. So 407 youth of color achieved permanency in that time frame. 61% returned home. As of October, only 93% continued to be at home, which meant that we had 7% of the children who had to come back into care. And that is our work going forward, is understanding why they had to come back into care. Because our goal is 100% of all children who return home stay home. And that is our work going forward. Looking at those who come back into care, what are the reasons why they did? And we are committed to working with our Department of Children and Family Services to track these children longer past the time LCFS may be involved. Our goal is they stay forever with their family, and even after our involvement with that family ends. We need to know that children who go home stay home. So people always ask me, well, what are the difference makers? How did you change the results? I think, first of all, we really moved into action because our data embarrassed us, made some of us angry, some of us upset, some surprised that we really needed to address this issue. So there were a number of process things we put in place. We had bi-weekly meetings with senior leadership staff, looking at our data, asking questions, looking at what we needed to do better, where were gaps. We had what we call practice forums, where we really talked about our work with birth parents, and not only with the moms, but with dads. What are the implicit biases that affect our work? And criticism around reunification for when a child must come back into care are some of the difference makers. We also think that in our state of Illinois, fictive kin by policy has been embraced. But in practice, it hasn't been fully embraced or championed. And I will share with you a very personal story. My dad was in the Army and served most of the time out of the country. My mom became very ill. I was 2. My sister was a newborn, and my brother, who is older, was 10. And my mom was hospitalized, and her diagnosis was dire. We went to live with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents. And my memories back then was, my goodness, my grandparents' house was huge. It was just so big. It was marvelous. And my sister and I often talk about, as we got older, we realized the house really wasn't that big. It was small. And she and I shared a bedroom. My brother shared a room with 3 of our cousins who my grandparents were raising. And they had 2 sets of bunk beds in one room. And the rooms weren't that big as we got older, but it was a place where there was so much love and caring. It really didn't make a difference. And that sometimes we need to really put on our lens through the eyes of children as opposed to eyes of adults. I'm really proud of our line staff, our child welfare specialists and supervisors, whose advocacy on behalf of the children and parents they serve have been strengthened as we work with other systems, including the court system. Language matters. Mike and I have had this discussion quite a bit. I started out in this field in child protection, and the language used then was intake and assessment. And it baffles me how we get to calling ourselves investigators. And I can tell you, as a person of color, once again, this is a personal story, somebody who knocked on my door and said they were an investigator, there is no way I would think that would translate into someone who wants to help me. Why do we call ourselves investigators? Why do we use the term for staff that they're placement workers? When we call somebody uncooperative, what are we really talking about? What does that really mean? Or are we simply putting a veil over, they're not doing what I want them to do, therefore they're not cooperative? I think we need to think about the words we use as we talk about engaging people and engaging parents. about that. I can give you examples. For example, I know, and this has been several years ago, we had staff who did service plans. And in one father's service plan, they put, "You shall not live a criminal life." This person had no criminal history. Why was that put in a service plan? We have to step back and ask, do we really believe in people's capacity to change, or we don't? Or are there some people we think can change and others we don't? And I said I should have a graph of this. I think of the percentage of children who've gone back to birth parents, of the 60%, I think 30% or 33% have gone to live with their dads if mom and dads were not living together. Fathers want to be inclusive. Words like disadvantage, underprivileged, marginalized, which are the words I heard people describe as I was in school, in high school, elementary school, including college. And I always baffled by those words, like, because I never felt disadvantaged, never felt marginalized or underprivileged. Like, what are you talking about? Or that fathers were absent. There were men and continue to be in my lives, grandfathers, uncles, cousins, neighbors. Who are you talking about when we think? So I think we need to think about language and we need to forget sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We need to forget that. Words matter and words have power. And I think the other thing is we need to celebrate any progress, and small or big, you have to take time to share with staff how proud you are about embracing this issue and doing the work. Even if it doesn't get you the result you want to, because I will tell you, the more you do, the more you realize you need to do. This is not a project. This is not an initiative. There's not a beginning, middle, end. This systemic racism has been around 400 years. So this is a journey, and you have to start somewhere. But it also then sometimes can be exhausting. And you also have to recognize that there will be naysayers in your organization, people you work with, in embracing this. You can't let them hold you back. You have to keep going and doing the work. And then my favorite pet peeve, and staff who work with me will tell you this, I will not accept that once a child gets a certain age, they don't need a family. That we need to stop talking about independent living as if that's a permanency goal for adolescents. We have to do better. We have to do better. Self-care is important. In doing this work, and once again, I'll use myself as an example. Things I had not thought about in a very long time have bubbled up for me over the course of doing this work. You have to know that's going to happen. What do you do with that? How you handle it matters. And you need to take care of yourself in doing this. And then I think we also learn there's a real difference between equality and equity. They are not the same thing in that little picture there. I think is a wonderful way of depicting the difference between the two. Then in our course of the work, the impact of race, the connectedness between serving the impact of race in what we call SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity expression, will come up. And as a result of that, LCFS has been involved with All Children and All Families, which is part of the Human Rights Campaign. And we are proud that we were able to achieve the designation as innovator in terms of surveying this LGBTQ plus population. We're really proud of that. But it also, and if you start there, I will tell you, the issue of race will emerge as well. So the question for all of us is, are we okay? Are we comfortable with disparate outcomes? If the answer for us, the answer is a resounding no. So part of our mission here today is joining together to address systemic racism and the impact on children and families, and that working together, we can dismantle this brick by brick, but it requires all of us to come together. So I leave you with this, and I want to share how I found this. For some of you, I lost my mom passed away last year. One of the traditions in our family is sending one another little notes, cards, just to say, thinking about you, I care. Anyway, I had 2 boxes remaining of my mom's things that I had not yet gone through. And I was going through one of the 2 boxes, and I discovered my mom had kept every single report card she had. I found her high school diploma. Anyway, I was looking through her yearbook, and I was looking through her yearbook. And there, going through the yearbook, there was this plain white envelope with my name on it, in my mom's handwriting. And I opened it up, and on a plain index card, this was the quote I discovered. I'm only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do something that I can do. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. Do something. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to spending more time with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beverly. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for your being a valued colleague, and for all the leadership you bring to LCFS and as a representative of LCFS within our state and our country. So I want to move on next to our next panelist, which is Rich Bobby. Rich has more than 20 years of child welfare experience in his career, and has included serving as a case manager at the Florida Department of Children and Families, overseeing community-based services in Tampa, which included intact families, foster care, adoption services, and an administrative role for the Children's Residential Treatment Center outside of Chicago. For the past 8 years, Rich has served in leadership roles with Little City, overseeing a variety of programs, including foster care and adoption services, a children's residential and therapeutic day school, and other in-home and family services for youth and families impacted by autism and intellectual disabilities. Currently, he is also serving as co-chair and member of various Illinois Child Welfare Advisory Committees and work groups. Rich has dedicated more than a decade of his time in collaboration with other industry leaders in challenging the status quo to improve outcomes for youth and families impacted by Illinois' child welfare system. He prides himself on being the squeaky wheel, I can attest to that, for positive change, and remains committed to racial equity for Illinois' system of care. Rich is married and a proud, imperfect father, as we all are, of 2 boys, ages 7 and 2, whom he vows to raise to understand they have privilege and should continue to fight to end this privilege. Welcome, Rich.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Beverly, and most of all, thank you for the work that you're doing, that LCFS is doing to really help spearhead this discussion for today. I think I'll first want to say a couple caveats. Is one, I don't know what I don't know. Going into this journey as a white male, I want to clarify something up front. Is that as a white male, I do not speak on behalf of all white people. I say that deliberately because one thing I've come to terms with is that as a white male, I haven't really felt the need or pressure from external sources to say that, unlike many people of color who do experience that, who feel like they have to represent all people of color, which is really unfair and really, again, contributes to the inequities that we experience in our society. So I don't know what I don't know. And what I want to do is at least share my journey of, before we do work, I found I have to reflect on myself and reflect on my own life circumstances, reflect on my own privileges and how I got to where I am today as we dive into this work. Because I'm a firm believer that we really can't address some of these issues until we start taking a look at ourselves first. So that's why in the beginning of this, I do want to talk about my story and my own self and how I came from unawareness to awareness of my own white privilege and the process that led me to this path. Because without me reflecting on myself and my own experience, I think it would be very difficult for me to be able to engage in this work, this much needed work. The first thing I want to talk about is how, whether I would say it or in the back of my head unconsciously believe it, I know when I reflect on my life, I looked at myself as hardworking. I worked very hard in my life. I wouldn't go as far as saying I was self-made, but in a sense, in the back of my head, I felt like I was very much one that led a close to self-made life. What I didn't realize was I had a lot of free passes, free life passes. And when I say work hard, I go back to my beginnings. Graduating high school, I fully funded 100% of my college education, and didn't get scholarships, didn't get any contributions from family or friends to be able to fund my education, and did it all on my own, so to speak, is what I sort of looked at. And I've always prided myself in doing that, and I should be proud of that. But at the same time, that's not also paying attention to all of the free passes that I got as a white male along that trip or along that journey. So I just want to go into and start with my own white privileges as I reflected on my own life in this process. One, first and foremost, I have 2 wonderful parents who thankfully are still alive and well today, who are very loving parents. And I had a 2-parent home. And with a 2-parent home comes a lot of privileges. And I will say up front that when I mentioned some of these privileges, like having a 2-parent home, I don't feel guilty for having a 2-parent home. I'm grateful that I've had a 2-parent home, but I have to at least acknowledge the fact that having a 2-parent home gave me some privileges that it might not give a person who has a 1-parent home, for example, or a parent who's working a single parent who's working multiple jobs. And so with that, with the 2-parent home, allowed for my parents, both were able to work. And because they were both able to bring in income, we actually had 2 cars. And what does that mean if you have 2 cars? Well, if I have 2 cars, on my 16th birthday, I was able to get a job working as an usher at a movie theater. I think I actually started on my 16th birthday. I was able to get a job because I had transportation to get there. I was able to work at a movie theater because the town I grew up in Carpentersville, Illinois, where I grew up, actually had a movie theater. So the fact that there were opportunities for me to even get a job at the age of 16 literally kept me off the street, kept me out of boredom because I was working at the age of 16. The other thing I want to bring up is that, I mentioned both my parents worked. My father, fortunately, at the age of 18, started a job here in Illinois, and he retired in that same with that same company. I mean, he was in that same employer with that same employer his whole career. And why that's important is because that's where we got our health care growing up. So I have never experienced not having health care. I've never experienced us having to question whether or not, maybe we don't really need to take you to the doctor. Maybe you could just kind of ride this out because we don't have the money, we don't have insurance to be able to afford the risk of you going to a doctor and then having to, fork over astronomical amounts of money for a bill. We had insurance that covered that bill. And so that was certainly a privilege that I always just took for granted until more recently. And I realized, like, wow, that is a huge privilege to have healthcare. And I'm grateful that I've had it. I don't feel guilty that I've had it, but I did have it and feel grateful that that was a part of something that I did not have to worry about, but it's a privilege I need to acknowledge today, because I can't make the assumption that everyone has lived the same privileges that I have when in doing this work. My mom stayed home until we were school age, so I never really saw a daycare. She then started working when we went to school, and eventually she retired at Walmart. She worked there for her whole career. So like those are, again, our experiences I was absolutely grateful for. Now, the thing that I would say are privileges that I'm not grateful for when I look back on it is it's actually quite sad, is that all of my teachers growing up looked like me. When I say look like me, is they were all white. That's concerning. I've never had the benefit to be exposed of any educator of color throughout my entire schooling. That's really sad. That's sad that I've missed out on that opportunity to grow and learn from many folks who have knowledge and experiences that I'll never learn because the folks that taught me look like me. Did I have other classmates of color? Absolutely. At the same time, though, I know just from the experience that I'm learning more and more is that there's that privilege that I automatically receive because I look like all my teachers. So therefore, they are going to be able to relate to me because of our white skin. Ultimately, it's just that already we have something in common from the get-go that's visible. The other thing that I'm not proud of, and certainly something that I've come to terms with, is that I did get consistent free passes from law enforcement. I grew up as an unruly teenager in my high school years. I really, looking back on it, I didn't have to question. I didn't have a talk with my parents about, hey, Rich, you really need to respect law enforcement. If you get pulled over, you need to put your hands on the wheel, you follow directions. We never had that conversation. It was never needed because my parents didn't really ever experience being pulled over for the color of their skin. They just never were. So I will share just a quick example. Is one time I was pulled over as a teenager by a police officer for speeding. And the cocky teenager that I was at the time, I actually questioned the police officer on his own radar detector and said that I don't believe that I was actually a speeding officer. And I challenged this officer that I think that he has his facts wrong. Really uncalled for, but I did that. Not only did I do that, I actually got out of my vehicle and I went over to his vehicle, to this police officer's vehicle, and stuck my head in his car to look at his radar detector to see if the speed matched what he said. And it was a mile off, but regardless, I still deserved the ticket and it still was speeding. But the fact here is I did that without question. And I have to ask myself, if my skin color wasn't white, would that have resulted in a different outcome? And I really wonder that. To challenge an officer to get out of my vehicle, to go to their vehicle, I had a free pass because I didn't know any other experience other than my white experience. And it was a white police officer who, looked like me. So that certainly is another example of a free pass that I received. I certainly am not grateful for by any means. And it's something that it's sad that, reflecting on it, that I was able to get away with things just because of, my white skin. And the one thing I want to add that's here is, I actually I grew up in Illinois, moved to Florida. And I did my then girlfriend, now wife. We didn't have any jobs. We had very little money saved up. We didn't have any family or friends to really help us out from a financial perspective. We moved out of state. I was able to sign a lease without having a job, not having a job lined up. It was in an apartment complex that was predominantly white. And no one questioned how we could afford this. We couldn't afford it at the time. Thankfully, we did end up getting jobs, but we didn't have the jobs at the time of signing the lease. But there was no question. There was no questioning. Can you afford this? We just freely signed a lease, and there was no questions asked. And I just, again, use those examples, and there's many, many examples, but those are just some highlights of my own privileges that, I've reflected on. I've reflected on more recently. And so, moving into, wokeness, I will say that my first experience into the world outside of the white experience was literally in graduate school. When I was working on my master's of social work, I had my first professor of color, and it was a cultural diversity course that I took. And it opened my eyes because, again, I grew up with other kids that had different skin colors, different nationalities, different neighborhoods, but I never had an educator who was a person of color. And in that experience, I had my first, what I would call my first awakening, where I was woke and realized not everyone has the same experience as I do. I've lived my whole life in a weird way, selfishly, thinking this is just how life is, and never really questioning or thinking about that. The second, the second awakening that's more recent that I think is really catapulted this in our nation is the horrific, tragic murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. This is an experience that certainly catapulted this dialogue and catapulted the work. So I'm going to go into moving from this wokeness to truly looking at, putting words into action. So after that experience, had a conversation with our executive director, Sean, and we had a conversation about, what is it that, that we can do, or what is it, I was itching to do something, and what is it I can do to really drive this from an organizational level with our colleagues. And I, have a, wonderful team, amazing directors. We pulled together and created a grassroots group of a racial equity group and started looking at our own anti-racist actions that we were doing to really combat systemic racism. So we started looking at our own policies, our own procedures, our own decision points, and how we do things. The second thing is, as mentioned, I'm a co-chair of a number of Illinois Child Welfare Advisory Committees. And one in particular, I'm the co-chair of the CWAC for short, Permanency Committee. And we just changed the name recently from CWAC Foster Care to CWAC Permanency. And I really love Beverly's presentation because it highlighted the need for permanency. And one thing we fail to talk about when it comes to permanency often in our own child welfare system is reunification and reuniting youth back with their families. There's a lot of conversation about foster care, building foster care, recruiting foster families, but we don't often spend as much time talking about how do we get kids back with families? How do we attach the relational permanency that Beverly was referring to? That's more than legal permanency. It's about how do we establish relationships so that someone has somebody in their life forever, not just until they turn 18 or until they turn 22, but for the rest of their life. And so we did create a newly created group, a reunification work group, that just never had a focus until more recently. So that group has started. Now I will say that the work is far from done. If we can go into there we go, implicit bias and decision points. What we found is, and this is nothing that I've certainly I've learned everything I'm sharing from others, is that, and Beverly mentioned as well, is that implicit bias is really a key point to address when it comes to looking at an equitable system. When we look at our child welfare decision points, when we look at the prevention services provided to families, when we look at how abuse hotline calls are screened, we don't have a blind screening process. What if we had a system that removed names, addresses, zip codes, all identifying information that's tied to race? What if we had a system that would remove implicit bias? What if we had investigations that, I really appreciated what Beverly we spoke to is, because we call them, investigations, but, what if those folks that are really assessing whether or not there was abuse or neglect had specific training when it came to implicit bias in making decisions as to whether or not they remove a child from a family? The permanency decisions that go into the day-to-day work. When we have child and family team meetings, are we using a racial equity lens in the referrals we provide? Who we invite to child and family team meetings? What do we stack the deck and unfortunately set up a situation where we create so many referrals for a family that it's already stacking the deck against them and creating the odds against them? If families don't have transportation to get to certain services, are we mindful of that? So all these are looking at decision points that we make in a child welfare system, and how we could look at those decision points, collect the data as much as LCFS has done, and look at making data-driven decisions based on those decision points, and looking at those decision points through a racial equity lens. And so with that, I will say that, at this point, I appreciate being here, and I thank you all for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Rich, and thank you for sharing your personal journey, as well as where your role at Little City and within our system is currently at. So our last panelist is going to be Zack Schrantz from UCAN. Since joining UCAN in 1990 as a relative foster care, in relative foster care, as you can see, most of us started from the ground up. Zack has led various management and policymaking roles at UCAN, which have spanned across broad areas of the agency, including youth and family programming, administrative and operational functions, and fiscal management. One of those strange guys who understands the numbers and likes the numbers. Zack is a staunch and active advocate of UCAN's comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, striving to set a standard for the nonprofit industry while concurrently ensuring that it remains a cornerstone of agency operations. This includes implementation of UCAN's Minority Supplier Diversity Initiative, as well as ensuring that leadership development opportunities are available for the agency's diverse employee base through its 11 staff-led employee resource groups. He believes that impact depends upon individual, organizational, and systemic change. I know when we started our journey years ago, UCAN was one of the places we looked, as they had really been focusing on DEI efforts for quite some time. So welcome to you, Zack.
Thank you. And thank you to Mike, Beverly, and LCFS for your leadership and commitment to this work. Thank you to Rich for sharing your personal journey and how you are looking to put your words into action for Little City in our system. And I appreciate the opportunity to do this work alongside of you. And also a thank you to our new national sensation and I think our first national youth poet laureate, Amanda Gorman, who reminded us yesterday, the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. The norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And we all must now get to work on this unfinished business, which she called us out and called us in for yesterday. As Mike shared, I believe fully that this work needs to be personal, organizational, and systemic. This afternoon, we'll share a little bit about UCAN and our journey in this work. UCAN is a 151-year-old organization with a 17-year-old journey, so it still feels like that we have some making up to do. Our mission is to build strong youth and families through compassionate healing, education, and empowerment. And our vision is that youth who have suffered trauma can become our future leaders. We believe that we cannot do this work if we don't incorporate DE&I in all aspects of our efforts. We serve more than 21,000 youth and families each year, predominantly in the Chicagoland area. Importantly, we are now headquartered and embedded in community in North Lawndale on the west side of Chicago. And I fully believe it's one of the best decisions that we've ever made, and UCAN is a better organization because of it. We keep a strong history and presence in child welfare, and so fully support the efforts about dismantling institutional racism within the child welfare system, but also believe, as Mike and Beverly and Rich shared, that it's also important to do that throughout communities and looking at how we expand that. So now a little bit about UCAN's strategies. Each individual's and each organization's journey has to be unique. You will have to figure it out for yourself about what makes sense. For UCAN, what made sense was to be holistic and substantive. We wanted to look both at internal areas, both our board, our leadership, our employees, as well as looking at external, how we engage with the community, how we engage with other nonprofit partners, community partners, churches, faith groups, and how we look to put our money where our mouth is in terms of supplier diversity. We'll be sharing some of our activities in each of these areas. I think one thing I do want to call out, and is very important, is that you have to have, I believe, you have to have leadership commitment, visibility, and humility in this work. We started our efforts 17 years ago with some training, and then also the formation of a diversity committee. And we had our diversity committee running, and myself and Claude Robinson, who's our EVP of External Affairs and Diversity, were part of that committee. And we were making some good progress for a year and a half, and then started feeling like we were getting a little bit stuck. We had a retreat of the committee, and after that retreat, the consultant pulled us aside and said, you guys are not going to make any of the progress that you state that you want to make if you don't make sure that you have your full leadership team engaged. And that was our aha moment. And that's when we realized that we needed to make sure that all of our senior leaders and our board needed to be involved and engaged in this effort. And we have done things like put a DE&I performance evaluation component in every one of our leadership teams' annual performance evaluation. And now we'll talk about some of the other areas of our strategy. I think personally, one of the most impactful areas of our DE&I journey has been through our employee resource groups. We have 11 different employee resource groups all coming together to help advance the mission and vision of UCAN through diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been a great way to advance our strategies, been opportunities for our leadership commitment to be demonstrated. So each of our 11 employee resource groups are sponsored by one of our senior leadership team members. It's been a great way to have employee engagement and employee development. It's an opportunity for me as a senior leader to get connected with our employees all throughout the organization. I do believe that our employee resource groups are huge assets to the organization and to those that partake in them, both personally and professionally. I know for me, I am the father of a 17-year-old now. My wife and I became foster and adoptive parents to a now 17-year-old African-American son. I know that I could not have supported our son without having the strong support of two of our employee resource groups. Our Alumni Involvement Council, which is made up of young adults who are full-time employees of UCAN, who grew up in one of our programs. They were participating in one of our programs, whether many of them grew up in either foster care or independent living or transitional living programs, or part of our youth development programs, and now came back and are paying it forward to the next generation of youth by working at UCAN. They have been a constant source of support, knowledge, insight for me and my family throughout this process, as well as our multi-ethnic affinity group. which is looking at what started as looking at just multi-ethnic individuals, but then fairly soon we broadened and recognized that more than half of our employees were involved in multi-ethnic families. And how do we help support them? And how do we help support the youth and families that we serve better, who are amongst multi-ethnic families? Both of those groups provide huge amounts of personal and professional support to me. We have more than half of our 700 employees have been participating in an ERG event last year. So this is not just something that a few people participate in. It has the potential to make a big impact on employee engagement and development throughout the organization. So now let's take a look at some of those numbers and the impact of that. We have been measuring for the last 10 years or so our employee engagement and around areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And consistently, these have been some of the highest rated scores in the organization. So we know and fully believe that our employees appreciate the opportunity to explore diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. And they feel that it is an attractive place to work, and that they see that they have an opportunity to advance at UCAN. I also know that the relationships that get developed through our diversity, equity, and inclusion work is amongst the most meaningful that I've experienced at UCAN as well. This is one of the ways in which we measure success. I think we're going to talk a little bit later on the panel about why it's important to measure success and ways to do so. Our governing board. 30 years ago, our governing board was 100% white. For 120 years, our governing board was 100% white. For the past 10 years, we've had a very intentional strategy to form a diverse and now majority minority governing board. It's a part of our governance, it's a part of our agenda, it's a part of our full board meetings, our committee work is all influenced by our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And one of the tools that's been very helpful for us to get there is through our diversity advisory boards. We have a 17-member diversity advisory board made up of really a who's who of diversity expertise across the Chicagoland area, all of whom are helping us advance the different aspects of our UCAN diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. We have experts here in supplier diversity. We have experts here in strategic planning. We have experts here around employee development, employee relations. All of these efforts have helped us advance the work that we're doing. I know that one of the areas that is important for any of us in terms of any of the work that we're doing is to make sure you have people that have done it before and know what they're doing. I know that we can call upon these 17 people and more to help us advance our work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another area that's been important to us in growing is the importance of economic equity and community investment. As we made the decision to move to North Lawndale 8 years ago, we knew that we'd have to invest, as we were investing in community, we knew that we'd have to put our money where our mouth is. It was important for us to spend with minority and female-owned suppliers. We set an ambitious target with the help of our diversity advisory board of 50%. So more than 50% of the spend on our new campus was going to be with minority and female-owned suppliers. With a lot of effort and with the support of that team, we were able to achieve 60.2%. We had 60 different diverse vendors that we invested $22.4 million in. This was very important for us to demonstrate and to invest in minority suppliers. And this is just in our capital spend. We also are looking now on an annual basis to look at how our operational spend, who we spend money with in terms of legal firms, contractors, suppliers, cleaning companies, all sorts of vendors that we have, and our capital spend. We've spent more than $40 million over the past 10 years combined. And I really want to encourage and engage and involve more of us in the nonprofit sector to do this. Imagine if 10 agencies spent $40 million, that would be almost $500 million of investment in local minority and female-owned businesses. Economic equity is also about jobs. We knew that when we were building the campus that we'd have to hire locally for the construction of that campus, and more than 59 individuals had a part that lived in the North Lawndale community, had a part in the construction of that campus. And that's good, but what's even more important for us is how do we invest in jobs locally moving forward? Just as we have learned a tremendous amount through our alumni. and the more than 20 or so alumni that now work for us, we have also benefited from the incredible knowledge, lens, and insight of our community employees. We have more than 75 of our employees live within the 2 zip codes right adjacent to our North Lawndale campus. And we know that that's just good business sense. They know the community, they know the families, they know what will be helpful and supportive for the community, and what won't be helpful and supportive to the community. And our commitment to community and DE&I, they are so intertwined, and we've recognized more than ever in 2020 that you cannot impact one without the other. Both with the exposure of the COVID pandemic and the racial injustice after the George Floyd murders, we knew that UCAN needed to be there as a good neighbor, march in solidarity with our neighbors, cleaning up after the riots, distributing food and PPE. We knew that we'd have to have a visible presence, and we are better because of it and for it. And just some final thoughts before we move into the panel. To be impactful, this work has to be personal, organizational, and systemic. And I think one of the things that both Bev and Rich called out is we have so much opportunity to learn with and through each other. And already I've learned a lot from Rich and Bev in some of our conversations, and I look forward to working with them through our Child Welfare Advisory Council to make more of an even larger impact. Another area that's important to remind ourselves is you can't delegate diversity. We must all get involved and active in this space. One of the, as we started off 17 years ago, our aha moment was that leadership needed to be engaged and involved. I also had a conversation with a former LCFS leader several years ago, and he said, you know, anytime there's a diversity, anything labeled diversity in a seminar and a conference or webinar, organizations automatically look to identify the highest ranking African-American or Latinx leader in the organization and ask them to represent. I think that's wrong. I think we all have to be involved. People of color and white people have to be involved in this work of dismantling institutional racism. We also must be in the business of strong diversity, equity, inclusion. We must plan for this work. We must plan strategically. We must plan operationally. We must adequately resource the work. If we don't put the people and the time to the effort, we're not going to make any progress. Nothing that you want to do, you're going to make a difference in if you don't put in the time and you don't put in the money. You have to execute, you have to measure and monitor, and you have to adjust. We have to take strong business principles into the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then finally, we have to be holistic, substantive, and relentless. We know, and I think we know even more so, that the systems of oppression certainly have been. We have to make sure that we are more committed to this effort and to make the type of world and the type of justice that Amanda Gorman called us out to do. So with that, I look forward to engaging in the panel discussion, and thank you all for your participation today.
Thank you so much, Zach. Appreciate it, and really want to learn from UCAN's example of looking at diversity of vendors and how economically you can impact DEI work. So Zach actually addressed one of the what I like to call the elephant in the Zoom room, is that here we are having a 2-hour annual meeting, web-based, on the common term diversity, equity, inclusion, and we have 3 white males and 1 woman of color. And we gave that some significant thought and chose to go with this. Both we liked the organizations that we asked to participate with us, but it's our mantra, and Zach said that racial justice is not the job of people of color. It's all of our jobs. And at LCFS, as Beverly shared, we require anybody supervisor and above to go through, well, before COVID was a 2.5-day anti-racism training, because the message is, if you're going to be a leader at LCFS in any way, then you also need to be about the fight of ending systemic racism. As well as, we're talking today and focusing on child welfare, which is the world that we live in as an organization. But really what we want to dismantle is institutional and systemic racism. The systems and institutions of our country were largely created by white males. So as a white male, I see that and our systems have not changed that significantly, where a lot of power still resides largely with white males. So it behooves us to be very active in changing that. And as Beverly said, it took us 450 years to get here. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're deeply committed to that. But we did not want to move farther on without acknowledging that our panel is largely made up of white males, and why our thinking on that was. And as Zach said it, and Beverly and I quasi joke, as many people are adding diversity officers in these times, it's always going to be a person of color, which is a good thing, given opportunity. And obviously a person of color is going to come with an understanding and background that I'm not. And as Rich spoke to, also it is not. So that's not a good, bad, or indifferent thing, but we did want to call it out. One of LCFS's organizational values that our board puts forward for us is transparency. So I wanted to be very transparent in acknowledging that situation. So now we get to the Q&A portion of our time. We've got about 45 minutes left. So we want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the racial equity work being done by each of these organizations. And the first question that I'd like to have each of our panelists respond to is, how has your organization incorporated its racial equity work into day-to-day operations, and how are you measuring the impact? And I think I'll ask Rich to answer that first.
Thanks, Mike. I think first and foremost, I will start with, we could always do better. We don't have it figured out, and I truly learn from the folks that are on this panel, because your work is, in my humble opinion, much further along than I think we would like to be right now. With that being said, though, we all have to start somewhere. And I would say that, looking at the purpose of our day-to-day operations, we have to look at outcomes, and the outcomes for the youth and families we serve. One in particular for our own program, our foster care and adoption program, is looking at outcomes of permanency. Much like Beverly's presentation, we're taking a hard look at reunification. What are the outcomes for those who are reunified, and how do we keep an emphasis on reunification and guardianship versus always going to the go-to of adoption? Not to say that kids couldn't or shouldn't be adopted, but let's not just rule out these other permanency options in the beginning. And what we're challenging ourselves currently to do is looking at our own decision points in our day-to-day operations, and the low-hanging fruit is the child and family team. When we make those decisions, when we make the referral decisions, are we using a racial equity lens? Are any of our implicit biases influencing our decision? And this doesn't have to do with, I think you mentioned it, Mike, just now, is regardless of the color of skin of the staff, we all have implicit bias. And so I think this is a lens where we don't just say, hey, only white folks listen to use a racial equity lens, but it's really every one of us, regardless of skin color, should be looking at the child and family team makeup through a racial equity lens. And from there, we have to believe, and this is where the measurement certainly comes into play, is again where I wouldn't say we're anywhere close to where we want to be, is that through that leveraging of looking at that racial equity lens decision point, that's where we hope to see positive outcomes for youth and families. And with that, I think this is a work that, it's going to go back to what Beverly said, 400 years, over 400 years, like we have a long ways to go here.
Beverly, so in addition to the data you showed, how else are we ensuring that it's implemented into our day-to-day operations, and what additionally are we measuring?
I'm going to share we did a survey of all the supervisors asking that question of them. And two things dominated. One was just having the data before them. not just a one time only, but regularly. They get to see where it is, because we had sites where there were no children of color achieving permanency ever. And staff were surprised by that. So having the data before them in a way that's easy to read and understandable made a difference. And then two, they talked about engagement, and that's our work now. What does that look like, and what does that mean? What are we doing differently that we weren't doing before that we call engagement? Our hypothesis thought, well, maybe it's the frequency of child and family team meetings. That doesn't seem to be true. What is different is engaging not only mothers, but fathers as equally important in a child's life as the mothers. So a difference really there, particularly if the mother and father are not living together, they're living separately. That fathers really feel that they're a part and included in what's going to happen with their children. And then moving from, and I think at LCFS, we've done a really good job with that. When we talk about permanency, we start with reunification rather than, and you said it, Rich, the conversation usually revolves around adoption. And that is and we all recognize that adoption is the most, for some children, the option available. But very rarely did we spend time talking about reunification. So we spent a lot of time talking about reunification, valuing that. What does that look like, and what does that mean? That I think has helped change the trajectory for the youth and care. But we're still trying to identify what I call the difference makers. But that's what we hear from the supervisors and line staff. And they would know best. They would know best.
Right. And Zach, you shared a lot of how you've really integrated a lot into the day-to-day at UCAN, as well as some of your measures. Are there some other aspects you'd like to highlight that weren't included in your presentation?
Yeah, so I think so for each of those areas that we talked about in our strategy, we want to make sure that we have measures of success for those. And so as I shared a few of those with our employees, our employee engagement, our leadership diversity on our board, and our senior leadership team, I think all of those things are important and important to regularly look at and see what those mean. I think the other area which we have integrated into our work is directly with our youth and families. And just as, we are getting better as an organization, and I think starting to get better as a country in acknowledging and talking about these systems of racism and oppression, we as adults aren't that good at talking about them. And if we as adults are not that good at talking about them, how do we expect our young people to? And so I think one of the things that we've done is to look at ways in which we can engage our young people in these conversations. We have a couple of groups. One is called Project Visible Man, and the other is called Phenomenal Woman, which are gender and culture-based groups that are helping our young people explore this. They explore the history of institutional racism. They explore a lot of these dynamics. They look at the strong African American and Latinx and female leaders and what contributions they've made to society, which all too often are not part of our kind of formal education systems. And so we want to make sure that we help encourage, engage, and support, and help our young people hold themselves and each other accountable for success. And, we then ask our young people, how do they feel like we are doing in terms of respecting their values and culture? And I think that's important to make sure that we're acknowledging to them that this is important. And how do you feel like we're doing?
Great. So we all know that recent events that I don't think to all of us know that are not necessarily uncommon, but with the advent of technology and a camera on every phone, racial injustice has really been highlighted, and the systemic racism that exists in our society have really been highlighted. So has that over the last year changed or affected how you're doing this work? And how do we come together as a system around addressing systemic racism issues in child welfare? And I'm going to ask Beverly to start us off on that.
Oh my, that's
That could be a whole 2 days, huh?
really. I think recent events just have magnified the need and the necessity to address this head on. No more impatience. It has a sense of urgency and importance. And I had shared with the panelists before we got started, my 10-year-old grandson is very disappointed in adults around this issue, which he has expressed to me. And he was very proud of seeing the 22-year-old yesterday, like, see, doing so I think for me, it's just highlighted and magnified, but I also hope that I think there has been momentum that it has to be addressed, and it's addressed across systems, not just a system, but across systems in general in our society. So I hope there's more momentum in embracing of the issue than before. Unfortunately, it took a number of tragedies for us to get to that point, but I think there's more ownership and wanting to do something, less talking and doing. So I think that for me is the big change, an important change.
Zach, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, and I think we were wanting to respond but not be reactionary. And I think we were wanting to be very careful not to just put out a statement and be done with it. And I think that really kind of supports your words are fine and words matter, but we have to also, get into some action. Just kind of want to bring it back to the personal, the organizational, and the systemic level. So I think for me personally, I think one of the things that I have been exploring much more in the last 6 months or so is involved in 3 different groups of white leaders exploring white supremacy, our role in white supremacy, and then our role in dismantling it. And, quite honestly, there was many years in which I didn't really want to, outside of my family and close circle of friends, I didn't really want to learn or talk with other white people about racism and white supremacy. And I've really been challenged during this time that I have to, that I can't leave it up to our leaders of color to, dismantle institutional racism. I have to play more of an active part, and I need to engage my white peers to do so as well. At the organizational level, I think we've had more intentional sessions and learnings with our board than we've ever had. I would say our board has always been fully aware of our DE&I strategies, and we report on how we're doing, and we had a diverse board. But I think really having these kind of personal discussions about the impact of racism and having our board learn from each other has been very valuable. And with that process, they really challenged us. And it sounds like, Bev, this is what you do to Mike, is what do we do next and how do we do it better? And for UCAN, we really committed ourselves to looking to deepen our advocacy work at the systems and policy change level. And so I really like that we have more than willing and capable partners, and Rich and Bev and many others to help do so. Also looking at how to integrate more intensely the concept of race-based traumatic stress on our youth, on our families, on our communities, and as our employees certainly called out, on our employees as well. With 2/3 of our employees who are employees of color, they face the trauma and the stress of racism every single day. What are we doing as an organization to help support them? What are we doing as an organization to help support the youth and families that carry this as well? And then finally, how do we use our experience and expertise to work more with others? And so again, appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and look forward to working very closely with both Bev and Rich with our Child Welfare Advisory Council. And We did achieve our first win in the last 6 months, and our Child Welfare Advisory Council is a group of 30 or so child welfare leaders that advise the DCFS director on policies, procedures, systems within the child welfare system. And quite honestly, it did not reflect the young people and families that we served. And as Bev kind of called out, the urgency of now, we were challenged to change that. And there was lots of reasons for why it took a long time to change. And finally, we just said, enough is enough. We have to figure it out. And now we're going into the new year with a Child Welfare Advisory Council that more than reflects the youth and families that we serve. And so that's one win. And then as Bev challenged us as well, diversity is great in one thing, but it's what are we doing in the policy and action phase. And so I look forward to helping be part of that and helping advance some of the work that needs to be done.
So, Rich, on that same question, and you in your presentation highlighted the George Floyd and some of the recent events, but is there anything else that you wanted to add around kind of that overall awareness within our country of what's been going on and how that can impact coming together as a system to at least start addressing that within child welfare?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. On a personal level, I've had to do my own education, and I've had to read, be willing to learn. I have I've been a big fan now of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and his books, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and other books that he's written. And one thing that seems to be the common theme is terminology and definitions. And what is the definition of systemic racism? Because if we can't agree on what the definition of systemic racism is, then I don't know how we as a system are going to be able to move forward if we're operating from different definitions. And so I think that is one piece that seems to be important. And we did reach out to we have our child welfare advisory committee that's part of the CWAC process, and there's a list of definitions that's already been drafted up by folks who do this work day in and day out that we've really circulated around, even within the CWAC permanency of making sure we're operating from the same definition when we talk about social injustice or systemic racism. With that, I would say that going back to something that Bev mentioned is we look at we've had a lot of conversations. It's putting those words into action. I feel honored and really privileged to work closely with Zach and Beverly on issues of this nature, and more recently co-authoring with Beverly a memorialized call to action to the director of acting director of DCFS and to the senior leaders of DCFS to have racial equity in the system. And I think it's safe to say, based on some of the research, and Zach just mentioned it, for the state of Illinois, over 43% of youth in the child welfare system are kids of color. Now, when you look at the data for the number of kids of color in Illinois, it's 15%. So there is a significant disproportionate number of youth of color that are in the child welfare system. Now, when we look at that, implicit bias has a significant impact on that process. And so, with Zach's efforts and Beverly's efforts, and yours as well, Mike, is that I think when we look at the system, we have a child welfare system because of racial inequity. We have the system we have inherited is because of implicit bias. So when we tackle these decision points, when we look at implicit bias, it's almost like we need a checklist to check our bias. And if you go through that process, when you look at the front end of the system, when there's deprived resources, supports for impoverished communities, already out the gate, it's what Beverly spoke to, is the inequities that already started right out the gate. And so how do we, as a child welfare system, look at those decision points, use that checklist to check our own biases so we're not contributing to the already challenge that this is?
Thank you, Rich. Yeah, very, very poignant. I use my daughters are all in their 20s now, but I used to say that I wake up every morning with their welfare at heart, and I hope they don't end up in foster care. So really, as a society, when we start supporting and nurturing families, is to me when we'll have a true child welfare system. And as you shared, the massive overrepresentation of children of color highlights the systemic racism that exists within child welfare, not just in other systems within our society. So I want to go to some of the questions from the participants, and I'm just going to ask, or maybe I'll try to moderate and ask people to ask. But one of them is, what is the one piece of advice you would give to an agency looking to start this work? Maybe Zach, you'd like to take that first.
Well, I think any journey starts with that first step. So make sure that you start to take that first step. And I think now we are also in a place where there are many experts, consultants that have worked with nonprofit organizations to help them, develop a strategy and begin implementing that strategy. So I think it's developing a strategy, a plan, and make sure that you adequately resource and put the time and effort and energy into it. Don't start it if you're not willing to do that.
And Rich?
I think it's safe to say, Mike, we're starting it. And so I don't want to by any means come across as though we have this figured out, because we're so far from it. We have just spotlighted it on ourselves, and each day we're challenging ourselves on committing to more than just, as I think Zach said eloquently, of just issuing a statement that this is important to us, but putting it into action.
Beverly?
Just know this is a long journey. There's no quick action, and make sure your organizational leadership is there to support you and resources. And it's not just a person who can do this, but don't start if you don't have your organizational commitment to addressing this issue long-term. I think you do more harm than helping. So a 2-day training for everybody is helpful, but that's not sufficient. So just know think about what it's going to take and whether your organization is ready. And if it's not ready, what do you need to do to become ready?
And there's a kind of a secondary part to that question, which is, we all have a lot of demands on our time as organizations and competing priorities. How do you make sure that this doesn't become a moment in time and stays at the forefront in your organization? How would you suggest and others do that to make sure that this doesn't get lost and put on the back burner? Beverly.
I think I think that you have to, at some point, it becomes embedded in your work. It's not something, oh, I have to do all of this and I have to do that. It gets embedded in the work, and hopefully you begin to have a critical mass of people, so that when you get exhausted, and you will get exhausted, or you need a break, that's fine, because you have plenty of other people who will carry on this work. But it's not, oh, I have my work and then we have this. It becomes embedded in the work day to day. And that takes time. But that goes back to the organizational commitment and resources and supports to do this, do this work. But don't underestimate, it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's not time limited.
And Rich.
Yeah, I think Beverly, you just said it best, is really ingraining and embedding this in the work. I know when we look at the child welfare system, there is the tendency to have almost like a separate discussion about racial equity. Like we're gonna talk about reunification, and then we're gonna talk about racial equity over here. When racial equity should be a part of the conversation of reunification, not let's have the reunification discussion and the racial equity discussion. So I think, yeah, you said it well, Beverly.
Thank you.
And Zach, you want to add anything?
I think they both, it's both at the personal level, you have to invest in it. And then I think you have to make sure that it's embedded in your strategic plan, your annual operating plans, and that you have measures and metrics that are regularly in front of you that look at these different areas.
I think to add a little bit of personal commentary, which I can't help but do, certain organizations just take different paths. Some go ahead and get a diversity DEI officer or some term. And that keeps it at the forefront. At LCFS, we have consciously said we're not going to do that this is the job of all leadership. And as the CEO, I own that part of that. My job is to make sure that this stays at the forefront and that this stays in our day-to-day work. So I think it's a different answer for each organization and so on.
I would also say that, no, we don't have a DEI officer, but we have the Inclusion Council that really have, and they represent the agency as a whole from all levels of staff, all programs on our staff, and we're all equal, who really keep us on track and honest and call us out when we need to be called out. And I think that's important too. Whoever you decide you want to have, you have to have that. Somebody who just says, we're sliding back, or that won't fly, or that's not holding true to who we said we want to be and become. You need that too.
I have a question that's specific from an attendee that's specific for Zach. It says, how did you get started with the ERGs? Did employees sign up, or did you identify people in the organization that would want to lead them? What type of structure is given to make them successful and aligned with the organization's goals? I guess that was numerous questions, but.
Yeah, so one, we'd be happy to offline share some of our ERG work and how we've accomplished that. As I shared earlier, that has been some of the most meaningful work that we've done, and ways to build relationships, engage people across the agency. Each of our employee resource groups has a different origin story. I think one of our first ones was our LGBTQ and allies group. And that really came out of that kind of anger and frustration about we weren't being who we thought we should be. And I remember we had a 22-year-old alumni who was working for us, and she had the courage to speak up and share with me that she would overhear a caseworker saying, I don't want to work with those gay clients. And we just said, that has to stop. We can't continue to perpetuate this harm on our the young people and families who were there to support. And so we asked her if she would help form our first employee resource group. We called them affinity groups at the time. I think some of the ways to make sure that they're successful and integrated with organizational goals is to make sure that you resource them. So you put, every one of our employee resource groups has a senior leader who's an executive sponsor. They don't run the employee resource group, but they are part of the employee resource group. So they provide some access to power and influence within the organization. They can help troubleshoot through barriers. And then I think as they've kind of organically grown in terms of membership by employees who say, this has been a great experience for me, why don't you come and join? And it's a way both to help support each other, but also help support the young people and families that we serve. And we have not found it to be a challenge to get people interested and involved in them. And it's been very rewarding.
The next few questions I'm just going to throw out and let people answer instead of calling and trying to turn it more conversational. But we have one from a participant that asks, how has the Black Lives Matter movement helped or hindered the conversation around institutional racism? Anybody want to take that?
I don't know that there's one answer for that. For some, it has heightened the sense of urgency and importance of this. For others, not so much. I don't know that there's been a unified, and I don't think in our country either, about how people have responded to that. So I think it has varied in our agency, Mike.
I think it's made maybe less, I know it's made our country a little uncomfortable, and I think that's good. I think we need to be a little uncomfortable. So I think from my perspective, it has helped to make more visible the real damage and cause that racism continues to perpetuate. So I think that's been very helpful. And I think for our board, it has been a call to action for them, I think, around really trying to explore this more. So I think it's been generally pretty positive, but yes, there has been, a lot of coded and uncoded language around rioting and what does that mean? And, there's lots of embedded racism in the language used to describe it as well. So certainly from a societal perspective, it's not all been positive, but I think from an organizational perspective, I think people have appreciated the visibility and the acknowledgement of this harm that has continued to be inflicted upon our Black and brown brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I think for many, it seems, because that is a very good question. Which is actually difficult, at least for me, to answer, because everyone's experience is so different. And when we've been engaging in some of the dialogue with our own team, what's come to light, and I've walked through life assuming that, many have the same belief system or same thought process that I do. And what's come to light is that is absolutely not the case. And we do have folks that have team members who actually do not believe systemic racism exists. And so, I think you said something, Zach, the coding of it, and sometimes whatever's said out in the media, depending on what source you're watching, it either helps or hinders. So I think, from a perspective of those who do not believe, I don't know if there's anything we can say or anything Black Lives Matters can do to sway someone who doesn't believe it exists. And I hope that it's truly, the name of this is brick by brick. It's brick by brick, the way I look at it. I don't know if we're going to have a complete overhaul or turn in someone's viewpoint unless we do it brick by brick.
So moving to another question. This is a complex one. What are the best resources, and then in parentheses, power motivations to engage racism personally and society-wide to eliminate it and temper its terrible impacts on children and adults? How and why are these powers resources more effective than others?
Dang, that's a tough one. So
Yeah, that person wasn't playing.
Yeah, well, and that's Darren. It's good to see your name pop up, and I think that's for those of us that are sports people. One of the signs of a good organization in leadership is a good coaching tree, and so it's certainly good to see Darren as another LCFS person very deeply committed to this work. So good coaching tree there. I think it's about, and I think particularly in the work that we do, people come into the work of child welfare because they want to help young people and families. And I think when we help our employees and our board members and our volunteers better understand the harm that has been caused by racism, I think it does help open up some hearts, and then hopefully that will open up some minds and help people learn. So I think that's kind of the, appealing to people's compassion and empathy, and why this is a particular space in which we need to have more empathy and more education.
I think for us, going through the 2.5-day Crossroads training, that systemic racism affects all of us, for people of color, for white people. We all are exposed to the same messages and the impact those have on us. So I think that helped create a framework so that we don't get into calling each other racist in the name calling, rather than having a framework that says, we've all been impacted. Can we talk about what those impacts have been on us personally, more, and then move to, in the work we do, how that gets expressed or played out is helpful. And I've just come to recognize there are people, no matter what you say, do, they are where they are. And for me personally, it's like, that is your choice. That's your decision. But I'm not spending hours trying to convince you otherwise. When you, if, and I hope you do, begin to think about it and may change your mind, then we can come to some discussion point. But it's not my job to convince you that systemic racism exists. I won't take that on. That's just Beverly. I'm not going to take that on. So it's complicated, but I think you have to find some common ground upon which to build and move forward. And there are many ways in which that can happen. And I think, with the three of us, you've heard different approaches about how, and there are more than these three, but you have to start somewhere. And sometimes what you plan, you realize isn't working, you need to do something differently. But the idea is to start.
Yeah, and Beverly, to your point, is it seems like a lot of this does come back down to definitions and how we define systemic racism, so that we're all operating from that same working definition. It's interesting, looking at some definitions that were researched for folks who this is their job and they're involved with this day in and day out. When you read the definition, it's really non-threatening. There's not this, because I think the stigma attached to you're racist automatically puts you in the defense of, you're assuming everything I do is racist. Therefore, I can't even have the conversation with you because you just think I'm a racist. And one thing that I've learned from researching and reading on my own on this, and mostly a lot from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, is that we have racist moments and we have anti-racist moments, and it's not you are that defined by that person, like inherently racist, but I am guilty of a racist moment at any given moment, and I'm also, it could be commended for anti-racist moments at any given moment, but it doesn't define who I am as a person. And it seems as we tackle this one by one, it does have to be reflected from that definition of personally, this is just my own opinion, is looking at my own implicit biases, and then looking at the systemic implicit biases, and maybe it's looking at it from executive, legislative, judicial process of what are the implicit biases inherently embedded in the system and that we could tackle. I'm going to use the brick by brick again, brick by brick.
Well, I mean, I've had parents who work for us who are people of color who ask that they not have a worker of color. And it's a fascinating and really learning discussion when they tell me why. Can we walk through why they are asking for that change? So it's not always about people of color and white people. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we have our own issues with people who look like me, we share that, that's what makes this complicated and not easy. And brick by brick, right? Brick by brick. So all of that plays in the mix, as well as, looking at yourself and what is it that you're bringing in to this discussion with your own implicit bias. That's why this is not easy. It's not easy.
Well, I want to be mindful of our time and get people back to their days. So I want to thank Zach and Rich and Beverly. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel and sharing in many ways both your personal journey, but your organizational journeys that you have been on. I have the opportunity to interact with all three of you frequently, and I'm pleased to know that I learned more today and have a lot to go and reflect on. So I want to thank you so very much, and appreciate working with you moving forward on our system here in Illinois. Before we wrap up today's event, I want to challenge everybody on this call. We had two goals as we went into this, and as you heard Beverly reference, or if you attended our meeting last year, we've continued this theme of around our work around anti-racism, and particularly within the child welfare world, to keep it at the forefront as we still have a lot of work to do. You've heard from three different agencies, ours and UCAN and Little City. We wanted to share different perspectives, but our other goal is to call everybody on this webinar to action. Whether you work, I know a lot of you work within the child welfare field. Some of you don't. I know we have board members from various entities. I know we have representatives of government that may or may not work within the child welfare system, but all of us needs to be a part of this fight. All of us needs to start. If we have not started, both personally and professionally, we're challenging you and asking you to start. Our children and our families deserve that, not just within the child welfare, but our commitment as an anti-racism organization is what are the other systems, what within our societies, not just our part of the world, do we need to be impacting, and do we need to use our organizational voice towards racial justice and the goal of racial equity within our world. So thank you so much for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules and busy lives. We will be sending out a post-event e-blast to all attendees with links to the resources discussed during the webinar, as well as the complete recording of today's presentation. I encourage you to share this email with other members of your organizations or network of people, because it takes all of us to ensure the change. Feel free to share widely. We do not, this is nothing, we would rather have more people see this and more people hear this message than less. So it is, as we send it out and the links, it is yours to share to the extent that you would like to. If you signed up to receive CEUs as part of your participation, you'll also be receiving a very brief email survey for you to complete about getting those credits. Thank you again today for all of you for joining us and for your commitment to children and families. I know many of the folks on this webinar, and I know your commitment, and I'm honored to have you spend some time with us today, and I'm honored to call you a colleague. Additionally, you'll have contact information for all of us. Please feel free to reach out to LCFS at any time, as well as Zach and Rich have also offered their contact information if you'd have any individual follow-up you'd like to learn more about their organizational journey. So thank you. God bless. Everybody have a great day and have a great weekend.